In the early 5th century, Alexandria was still one of the greatest cities on earth. Though its famous library had already suffered devastating losses over the centuries, the city remained a center of learning, philosophy, science, and debate. Ideas from Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the Near East collided in its streets. Philosophers taught openly, astronomers studied the movement of the heavens, mathematicians debated geometry and numbers. It was a city where the human mind was pushed to its limits. And at the center of this intellectual storm stood Hypatia. Hypatia was born around the year 355 or 360, the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself a respected mathematician and philosopher. Unlike most women of her time, Hypatia was not trained only for domestic life. Her father raised her as a scholar. He taught her mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, and encouraged her to think freely, critically, and fearlessly. Under his guidance, Hypatia did not simply learn existing knowledge. She refined it, expanded it, and taught it to others. By adulthood, Hypatia had become something almost unheard of in the ancient world. She was a woman publicly teaching men. She lectured on Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy. She wrote commentaries on mathematical works, such as those of Diophantus and Apollonius. She designed scientific instruments, including astrolabes and hydrometers. Her students came from across the Mediterranean, including pagans, Christians, and future political leaders. Hypatia dressed simply, lived modestly, and devoted herself entirely to learning and teaching. Ancient accounts describe her as calm, dignified, and intellectually formidable. She did not seek power, yet power came to her naturally because people listened to her. They respected her wisdom. They trusted her judgment. And that trust would ultimately cost her life. To understand why Hypatia was murdered, you must understand the world she lived in. The Roman Empire was changing. Christianity, once persecuted, had become the dominant religion. Pagan traditions, philosophies, and religious practices were increasingly viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Alexandria, in particular, was deeply divided. Religious tensions between pagans, Jews, and Christians frequently erupted into violence. In this unstable environment, political authority was split. There was the Roman prefect Orestes, representing imperial power, and there was Cyril, the Christian bishop of Alexandria, representing religious authority. These two men were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the city. Hypatia became entangled in this conflict, not because she sought it, but because of who she was. Orestes admired Hypatia and often sought her advice. As a philosopher trained in logic and reason, she represented a world rooted in classical thought rather than religious dogma. To many radical Christians, this made her dangerous. Rumors began to spread that Hypatia was preventing reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. Others whispered that she practiced magic, that her science was sorcery, that her influence over powerful men was unnatural. In a society increasingly defined by religious absolutism, Hypatia embodied something threatening. She was a pagan philosopher. She was a woman who spoke with authority. She was respected by Christians without being one. And worst of all, she represented reason in a time when fanaticism was gaining ground. The anger against her did not explode all at once. It grew slowly, fed by sermons, gossip, and fear. Radical Christian groups, particularly a violent faction known as the Parabolani, were already notorious for attacking perceived enemies of the faith. They had assaulted Jews, they had intimidated political officials, and now their attention turned toward Hypatia. In the year 415, the situation reached its breaking point. One day, as Hypatia traveled through the streets of Alexandria, she was ambushed by a mob. Ancient sources describe them as Christians, led by a man named Peter, often identified as a lector, a minor church official. This was not a spontaneous riot. It was a targeted attack. They dragged Hypatia from her chariot. Imagine that moment, a woman known throughout the city for her wisdom, her calm, her dignity, suddenly surrounded by shouting men filled with rage. There was no trial, no accusation spoken aloud, no chance to defend herself. The mob did not see a human being. They saw a symbol of everything they hated and feared. They took her to the Caesareum, a former pagan temple that had been converted into a Christian church. What happened next is almost impossible to read without horror. According to the historian Socrates Scholasticus, one of the primary sources for her death, the mob stripped Hypatia naked. This act alone was meant to humiliate, to erase her dignity, to reduce a great mind to a vulnerable body. Then they murdered her. They did not use a quick weapon. They did not show mercy. They used sharp objects, often described as roof tiles or oyster shells. They flayed her flesh from her bones. They tore her apart piece by piece. This was not just killing. It was ritualistic destruction. After her body was destroyed, the mob gathered her remains and burned them outside the city. The message was clear. Hypatia was not merely to be killed. She was to be erased. The city of Alexandria was left in shock. Even many Christians were horrified by what had been done. Socrates Scholasticus wrote that the murder brought great disgrace upon the Christian community. Yet no one was punished. No justice was served. Cyril, the bishop whose followers were widely believed to be responsible, faced no consequences. In fact, he would later be declared a saint. Hypatia's murder marked more than the death of a single person. It symbolized the collapse of an era. With her death, Alexandria lost one of its last great classical philosophers. The tradition of open philosophical inquiry that had defined the city for centuries was fading. Fear had replaced debate. Dogma had replaced dialogue. In the years that followed, intellectual life in Alexandria declined sharply. Pagan schools closed. Scientific inquiry was increasingly constrained by religious doctrine. While knowledge would survive in other parts of the world, particularly in the Islamic Golden Age centuries later, the spirit that Hypatia represented had been violently silenced in her own city. Hypatia left behind no surviving writings in her own hand. What we know of her work comes from references by others. This absence itself feels like another form of violence, as if history itself conspired to erase her voice. Yet her legacy endures. Hypatia has become a symbol of many things. She is remembered as a martyr for philosophy, for science, for reason. She is remembered as a victim of religious extremism. She is remembered as a woman who dared to exist intellectually in a world that increasingly refused to tolerate such freedom. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when belief becomes more important than truth? What happens when power fears knowledge? What happens when a society decides that some voices are too dangerous to be allowed to speak? The murder of Hypatia was not inevitable. It was the result of choices. Choices made by leaders who inflamed hatred. Choices made by followers who surrendered their humanity to fanaticism. Choices made by a society that allowed violence to replace dialogue. Even today, Hypatia's story resonates. Around the world, scholars, journalists, scientists, and thinkers still face threats for challenging dominant ideologies. Women in particular continue to be targeted for speaking with authority. The forces that destroyed Hypatia did not vanish with the ancient world. They changed form, but their core remains the same: fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of minds that cannot be dominated. When we remember Hypatia, we do more than recount a tragedy. We issue a warning. Progress is fragile. Knowledge can be destroyed, and civilization is only as strong as its willingness to protect those who think differently. Hypatia did not carry a weapon. She did not lead an army. She did not call for violence. Her only crime was thinking freely and teaching others to do the same. And for that, she was torn apart in the streets of one of the greatest cities in human history. If this story disturbed you, it should. History is not only a record of triumphs, it is also a record of what happens when humanity fails itself. Hypatia's life reminds us of what is possible when reason is allowed to flourish. Her death reminds us of the cost when it is silenced.